This podcast includes discussion of rape and sexual assault, abuse, murder, and other criminal behavior. Listener discretion is advised. Sean Young, one of the attorneys who had represented Doug Lovell during his 2015 capital murder trial, met with the attorney handling Doug's appeal of his death sentence in March of 2019. That second attorney, Colleen Coburg, made an audio recording of their conversation.
I'm done with Doug. I don't care what happens to Doug. I used to care. I don't care anymore.
Okay. And I appreciate that.
He's a sociopath. I'm done with him. You can tell him I said that. Hi, Doug.
If you didn't catch that, Sean called Doug a manipulator and a sociopath. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, so let's take a moment and review. Doug Lovell's rape and murder of Joyce Yost in 1985 had created a legal mess. His guilty plea to capital murder in 93, followed by his conviction for the same crime at trial in 2015, meant he had twice received a death sentence. But by 2017, the case had once again become bound up by an appeal. Doug had claimed Sean Young had torpedoed the 2015 trial by failing to call many people Doug had identified as potential character witnesses. He had also claimed lawyers for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had interfered with the testimonies of several people Sean had called to the witness stand. Doug also opened a second front on Sean by filing a complaint against him with the Utah State Bar, which he mentioned in this letter to Judge Michael DeRita.
The Utah State Bar investigated Mr. Young and on March 2, 2017, voted to direct the Office of Professional Conduct to file a formal complaint against Mr. Young in district court.
Doug's wasn't the only bar complaint pending against Sean. There were others rising out of at least 20 different cases. Sean reached an agreement during the summer of 2018 to settle all those complaints. As part of the agreement, he signed a statement admitting fault in Doug's case. The statement said Sean had failed to screen all but 2 of the 18 witnesses assigned to him during Doug's trial, that he had failed to question the witnesses who did testify about their beliefs Doug was a remorseful man, and that he had capitulated to the church's lawyers. A judge suspended Sean's law license for a period of 3 years. Sean told the Deseret News at the time he didn't agree with the claims in the statement, but had signed it simply to put the matter behind him. Meantime, Doug's new appellate attorney, Colleen Coburg, was dogging Sean. She had learned he possessed hundreds of emails that could be relevant to Doug's appeal. In a sworn affidavit, Colleen wrote Sean had repeatedly told her he would provide them, then repeatedly failed to do so. She had to ask Judge DeRita to issue a court order demanding Sean surrender his emails, which the judge did. And so that's why Sean and Colleen met at a courthouse in Salt Lake City to make that exchange in March of 2019.
Okay, you've given up every document that you have. Okay. Are there any...
Sean told Colleen he disagreed with any suggestion his representation of Doug had been ineffective.
I did my best to help him. I actually cared about Doug. I did my best I could. I gave him advice. I said, hey, waive the jury, and go right to Judge DeRita, like you did with the original judge on the case. I forgot. He didn't want to do that. Judge Taylor. He said, no, Judge Taylor already sentenced me to death one time. I'm not going to waive my jury trial. I'm on jury. He said, no jury's going to convict me. And I told him to take the stand. Those are my 2 pieces of advice that we talked about doing the whole time, and the last one he backed out. So he manipulated me the whole time, and I'm done with it.
We came in first.
Sean said he refused to spend any more time on Doug.
I sit and waste hours and hours on this case. I've been paid $1. I'm not $100,000 on this case, and I'm kind of done with it. I'm frustrated. You guys get paid, Sam got paid, everyone gets paid except me, and I'm kind of sick of it. And the worst part...
Sean said he wouldn't get his law license back, even if the court decided his work for Doug had been up to par.
You're not going to help me. You're not going to help me.
We're trying to help Doug.
I don't care about Doug. He's a manipulative sociopath. I'm kind of done with him. He manipulated me, he manipulated Sam, he manipulated you, he manipulated everybody. That's what he does. That's all he does. He's manipulative.
Doug Lovell had not been able to convince a single juror he deserved a chance for parole. But he was about to work his way out of maximum security at the Utah State Prison and one step closer to his ultimate goal: freedom. This is the finale of Cold Season 2, Episode 13, Last Chance. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. Back after this break. Doug Lovell happened to be listening to the radio on April 3rd, 2019, when he heard a woman named Candice Madsen on the airwaves of KSL NewsRadio.
With your kids, you want to be the hero, right? You want to be in charge of everything. I think it's okay for your kids to see you be vulnerable and to let your kids know that you struggle, but that you got help.
Candice worked as a producer for KSL TV and was promoting a documentary called Hope in Your Darkest Hour. The 22-minute program profiled several people affected by suicide, including some who described their firsthand struggles coping with thoughts of self-harm.
Life is hard. We can't do it alone. We just need to reach out and support each other and validate without judgment. I think people are so afraid of being judged.
Doug wrote Candice a letter that same day.
Dear Ms. Candice Madsen, I just got done listening to you talk about suicide on KSL Radio. I thought your comments were spot on.
The letter wasn't the only item Doug put in the envelope.
Enclosed is a pamphlet which has a story about a little mouse I crossed paths with here at the prison many, many years ago. I decided last year to write about my experience with the mouse in the hope that it could be used to help prevent suicide here in Utah and elsewhere.
The front of the pamphlet included an illustration of a rather plump gray mouse holding a small cube of yellow cheese. Above the mouse were printed the words, Unforeseen Angel. Candice opened the pamphlet and started to read.
It was pretty basic. It didn't give very much information about him other than that he was an inmate.
When I was a little boy, our family of 5 moved out to the country to live on a small farm. I found that I had a love for animals and a special way of connecting with them.
Let's fast forward through the bits where Doug described his parents' divorce, his brother's death, and his descent into drug and alcohol abuse.
Eventually, I did the unthinkable, for which I was sent to prison, taking the life of an innocent person.
He did not bother to say who this person was or why he had killed her, but said his arrival at the prison had sent him into a well of depression and, quote, spiritual darkness.
One day, a little furry-faced mouse came wandering into my cell, clearly looking for trouble or an easy snack. This was the happiest moment on A Block. I was happy to give the little guy anything he wanted.
Doug spent the next 4 paragraphs detailing his interactions with this mouse, describing how he had lured the critter by rubbing peanut oil between his fingertips. He said he had talked to the mouse, finding it an attentive listener.
May sound strange to most people, but that little creature that God put on this earth distracted me just long enough to help me get through the darkest, loneliest, most unstable time in my life.
He concluded with a proclamation that all people are children of God with value and purpose. He offered suicide prevention resources.
If you find yourself in a very dark place, struggling to find hope or purpose in life, please take the first step toward a brighter, happier, more fulfilling life.
Doug used the word I 30 times in this narrative. The name Joyce Yost did not appear once.
This pamphlet was so well produced. You know, it's professionally done. So I was was able to do that in prison. And so I just thought that was interesting.
Candice turned the pamphlet over and saw a logo on the back. It read, Rising Star Outreach. Candice showed the pamphlet to a friend, who asked if she knew who Doug was or what he had done. A quick search through the KSL archives refreshed her memory. She discovered the evidentiary hearing tied to Doug's appeal had not yet happened, but was just around the corner.
And I started thinking, I wonder if he's just trying to kind of get character witnesses.
Utah 2nd District Court Judge Michael DeRita spent most of the month of August 2019 on that evidentiary hearing.
All right, let's turn to the matter of State of Utah versus Douglas Lovell. This is case 921-900407. Counsel, will you state your appearances for the record, please?
Doug's appeal of his 2015 death sentence revolved around the idea his defense team hadn't done a good job. This is a typical step in many death penalty appeals, but the Utah Supreme Court had wanted more information before making a ruling on Doug's claims of ineffective counsel, so it had sent the appeal back to Judge DeRita on what's known as a Rule 23B remand.
This is the time scheduled for evidentiary hearing on an order from the Supreme Court to this court under Rule 23B. Court has had an opportunity to meet.
I have reviewed hours of this testimony, but rather than plow through it all chronologically, I'm going to jump around a bit to better focus on a few particular points. I'll start with Doug's mouse. During the hearing, former prison guard Carl Jacobson recalled Doug having once befriended a rodent, but it wasn't a mouse.
He had a pet squirrel once, clusters, trained it, and had it in his room for the whole summer. And one day I confronted him and said, Doug, this is disgusting. You and your roommate Chewy have done things wrong, and you're in jail for a reason. This squirrel has done nothing. It needs to be out chasing girl squirrels, and it needs to be gathering nuts. And I said, you keep it in a prison as your little pet. You are disgusting. And I left. Next day I come back, Doug Lovell. I go, where's the squirrel? He had let it go.
Kent Tucker, who was married to one of Doug's cousins, also brought up Doug's treatment of animals.
So I've always, you hear about bad guys, and usually they don't want nothing to do with animals. They'll kill animals and stuff like that. Doug that's never been his nature. He's just got a kind heart.
Kent said he had seen that kindness all the way back in Doug's earliest years, when he was just a boy on the farm.
I mean, he's had skunks and squirrels, and down at the prison, they even had a mink come in that they brought to him and asked Doug if he was interested in this mink, which it was a wild animal, and Doug actually got it to where he could put it in his pocket, and he was working in the print shop at the time, and he was taking this mink with him to work.
So was this mouse mentioned in the pamphlet a real thing? Or was it an amalgam? Part squirrel, part mink, part story borrowed from the movie The Green Mile. Doug's character witnesses painted him not just as a protector of animals, but also as a shepherd of men. Leon Denny, who had served time in the Utah State Prison in '88, described how Doug had helped him overcome his anger.
I think I stopped hating so much. I was really filled with hate because it made me start looking at myself and realizing that, I had to step up to the plate.
Leon had not testified at the trial, but said he would have gladly done so had Doug's defense team bothered to ask. Other witnesses told of how Doug had cared for fellow inmates when they were ill or despondent.
He encouraged them, and he'd say, you can still go back to God. You can still get your life right. And how do I know that? Because he would say to them, if you don't believe me, write Becky Douglas. Well, I have had more than 40 prisoners writing to me because Doug Lovell said to them, there is a way for you spiritually to come back to the Lord. I've been writing to these people.
Becky Douglas had discovered in Doug an enthusiastic booster for her nonprofit, Rising Star Outreach.
The more I got to know Doug, the more I was very impressed with how remorseful he was, how much he wanted to do good, how much he cared about the children at Rising Star.
Doug had spent the last decade talking up Rising Star to anyone who would listen. In fact, several of his witnesses, including his bishops, confessed he had talked them into contributing. Becky said Doug had spent years taking correspondence classes on religion. He had watched a TV series about the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and another about the New Testament. then sent her letters explaining how each had strengthened his faith.
These aren't the actions of a person who is pretending to be suddenly come to Jesus or religious in order to get a light sentence.
And yet, one of the bishops who had ministered to Doug, a man named Brent Sharman, admitted deep discussion of spiritual matters had been the exception rather than the rule during their Sunday visits.
It was more typically about everyday issues and what was going on in his life and my life and in the world at large.
Which led the state's attorney to ask if Doug's turn to religion might have been an act.
If it's an act, it's a very good act.
Doug had once told his ex-wife Rhonda, "You can't be in control unless you manipulate." Russell Manass, the attorney who had helped Doug arrange visitation with his son in the late 90s, said he didn't see their friendship that way.
You don't think he's manipulating you?
No.
And that's on the basis of telephone calls?
Right.
That he controls?
One of those phone calls had come shortly after Doug had received the death verdict in 2015. Doug had called Russell, upset, wanting to know why he had turned his back on him.
He thought that I had changed my mind about appearing to testify. He had no idea why I wasn't there. He felt that I'd betrayed him. I did everything that I could to reassure him that I wasn't there because nobody ever called me to testify.
I noticed a pattern as I listened to all this testimony. Day after day, witness after witness, the questioning almost seemed to follow a script. Appellate attorney Colleen Coburg would start, eliciting answers that suggested trial defense attorney Sean Young had dropped the ball.
Had you had any communications with Mr. Young before he called you to the witness stand such that he would understand and know what you were even going to say when he asked you questions?
No.
She asked the witnesses who had dealt with the attorneys for the Church of Jesus Christ to explain what the church's lawyers had said and done.
And what do you think their focus was?
Well, I think they were interested in protecting the good name of the church.
Assistant Utah Attorney General Mark Field would then take over. He would use cross-examination to reveal how little any of these people knew about what Doug had done to end up on death row. That was true even for Leon Denny, who had met Doug in prison when Doug was still denying having raped Joyce.
Is it possible that Mr. Lovell really was falsely accused of rape?
He never told me that. I mean, he didn't. I have never sat down with him and discussed what he was in for, ever. You know, it isn't something you go around asking people what they're in prison for. It can cause just some problems, okay?
Mark Field would also point out how none of the witnesses who had met Doug since he had received the original death verdict in '93 had ever interacted with him outside of maximum security.
Have you ever seen how Doug Lovell reacts when a woman refuses his advances?
No.
Wouldn't you think that someone who is capable of murdering another person in order to not go back to prison would be at least as capable of feigning remorse in order to get out of prison?
Sure.
Okay.
The point Mark was making here was that the trial defense team might have had good reason not to deeply probe all of Doug's supporters in front of the jury.
Because you don't want to call people who are going to testify that Lovell should have life without parole. Right? You can't call those people. You can only call people who will say unequivocally, Doug Lovell should be out. Because if they say anything different, then the way Doug Lovell has set it up, it's got to be death.
Remember, Doug had refused to allow the jury the option of life without parole. Mark suggested Doug had for years intentionally kept his supporters in the dark, with the singular goal of someday getting out of prison.
You know, you said that Mr. Lovell is honest, and I want to kind of get to the bottom of that because you've also said that you never talked about the crime. Is that right?
That's right. I think he would have told me if I had asked him.
Well, did he ever volunteer it?
No.
This meant each witness was vulnerable to facing those facts for the first time on cross-examination.
You would let him out of prison because you think...
I certainly have heard things here today that I haven't heard before. So, as you indicated and I acknowledge, he gives me some reason for pause.
Mark exposed other vulnerabilities, like how Gary Webster, the former bishop and parole board member, had actually signed the papers that let Doug out of prison early in the armed robbery case.
That was when you were there at the Board of Pardons and Parole. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, how do you know that Doug Lovell won't do the same thing when he gets out this time?
I don't.
What would the jury have made of that statement in 2015 when weighing the choice of giving Doug a chance at parole? I'm going to focus for a moment on the testimony of Becky Douglas to provide a better sense of how the state's line of attack worked. Mark asked Becky if she knew about Doug's conviction for armed robbery in '78. She said no.
So you didn't know that he had been released in 3 years, right?
Right.
This queued up a string of follow-up questions.
Do you know what he did 2 years later, 3 years later?
No, I'm sure you're going to tell me.
He raped Joyce Yost.
Okay.
He drew out each detail of the crime, starting from when Doug had first seen Joyce at the Pier 3.
He watched her come out of that restaurant, and when he saw her get in her car, he followed her home. Did you know that?
I knew that. Could I say that what he did was unbelievably heinous and atrocious and horrible? And as a woman, I think as women, we all live in fear of this exact kind of thing happening. And I feel for what happened to Joyce Yost. And I don't think I need to know the details of what happened to Joyce Yost. What I need to know is what happened to Doug Lovell after that happened.
But Becky was not in control of this narrative. Mark continued, describing what had happened when Joyce had arrived home.
Did you know that he then looked at her and said, "You're attractive. Do you want to go have a drink with me?" Did you know that?
No, I think I've made it very clear that I didn't know what happened at that time.
Mark forced Becky to acknowledge what she knew or didn't know, never flinching away from the facts.
Well, did you know that after he did that, he was aroused enough to then sodomize her? Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
He didn't tell you that, did he?
I think I've been very clear about that.
Is that no, he didn't tell you?
Seriously? You don't think that's a no? Of course it's a no. I mean, this is almost an insult, right? Can you just simply tell me what you want me to say no to? And I'm happy to say no.
He asked about Doug's efforts to hire a hitman who had then failed to follow through. Becky said that she knew.
Did you know that he hired a second person?
I knew that also.
And do you know that that person said no?
Yes, I read all this on the internet.
Mark described the night of Joyce's murder, how Joyce had begged for her life as Doug force-fed her Valium and drove her into the mountains.
And he choked her till she was unconscious. Were you aware of that?
No, but I think if you'll turn around, you'll see that there is remorse. The man you're talking about is
Your Honor, this is not responsive.
As you talk about these terrible, horrible things that he did, he's over there weeping. And you ask me how I know he's remorseful. I think that's one answer to your question.
So tears to you indicate sincerity?
Well, I think tears show sorrow.
Well, I guess that's your opinion.
Becky came through this gauntlet, only to then face perhaps the most critical question.
Wouldn't you agree that there's at least some risk that if Doug Lovell gets out, he may harm another person?
I think that risk is so low it's negligible.
Okay, but it's not zero.
It's not zero for me either, or you either. We all have the possibility of harming another person.
Well, but we know that Doug Lovell raped and murdered a woman, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Doug's character witnesses were not unified in their responses to this final question. Some said their newfound knowledge of Doug's crimes did give them pause in supporting his bid for parole. Others, like former Bishop John Newton, equivocated.
Wouldn't life without parole just be the safest alternative?
Well, you're saying safest. Would it be a safe alternative?
The safest.
Well, that implies that you know how Doug's going to act in the future. I don't, and you don't.
Yes, but Mr. Newton, one of your daughters is now the age that Joyce Yost was when that man raped and took her life. Do you understand that?
Give me the dignity of being a professional. Of course I do.
On one point, though, the witnesses all seemed to agree. The Doug they knew was not the same man who had killed Joyce all those many years ago.
Doug and I have not spoken about this, so I think that all this is irrelevant. I've already testified.
I'm sorry, did you just say...
haven't spoken about it.
Did you just say it's irrelevant?
Yes, because I don't know that Doug. I only know the Doug that I met in 2007.
One final point before we move on. During the evidentiary hearing, several of Doug's witnesses said something like this.
And I know on more than one occasion he's declined an opportunity to be interviewed because he's concerned that somehow the publicity of this will reach his victim's family, and he feels, in my opinion, a great amount of remorse and is aware of at least to some degree, the suffering he's put them through and doesn't want to make that worse.
Candice Madsen, my colleague at KSL TV who had received that pamphlet from Doug in the mail, attended parts of the evidentiary hearing. She noted how much older Doug looked compared to his appearance in '85 or even '93.
And then the other thing that was kind of heartbreaking is Joyce's daughter was in that courtroom alone.
I asked Kim Salazar about this idea Doug not talking about Joyce was somehow meant to spare her family additional pain.
If he were trying to minimize our pain and suffering at this point, we wouldn't still be on a 23B remand 35 years later. He'd be done. This thing would be done.
But it's far from done.
He hasn't even scratched the surface of the appellate process. We're still arguing about ineffective assistance of counsel. It's ridiculous. So he is not trying to spare us anything.
Candice wrote a letter of her own in the fall of 2019.
I just said basically that I was interested in interviewing him. I wanted to bring a producer and send it. I think it was only a paragraph long.
Doug's reply arrived soon after.
I appreciate your offer to come to the prison to interview me, but I must decline. Whenever I'm in the news, I know that it is very upsetting to the family and loved ones of Ms. Yost. Each time I am in court, I believe it is very difficult for them.
Well, I wrote back and made it clear that Joyce's family knew that I had reached out to him, and I never heard back.
Doug had included another full-color pamphlet containing a different inspirational message about his life in prison, published again by Becky Douglas's charity, Rising Star Outreach.
I mean, I believe in redemption and that people in prison should have an opportunity to do good, but I question his motives.
I had been working as a radio news producer at the time of Doug's 2015 trial. I was aware of it then, but only superficially, as the story of a very old murder which had been solved, but was back in court on a technicality. It wasn't until Candice came to me and talked about receiving the letter from Doug that my interest was piqued. Like Candice, I dove into the archives. The stories I found all seemed to focus on Doug. It became clear to me that Joyce's story, like Susan Powell's, had not been told. I couldn't shake the feeling Joyce deserved better. So I spent more than a year tracking down sources, digging up old audio, poring over court transcripts, and searching for a secluded mountain gravesite.
The only thing I believe is she's not where he took us.
Yeah.
You gotta be somewhere else. But I can't believe that I refuse to believe that he doesn't know where she's at.
Bill Holthouse doesn't believe cougars or coyotes are to blame for Joyce not being on the mountain below Snow Basin. Neither does former South Ogden Police Sergeant Terry Carpenter, for that matter.
He went back there how long after he killed her and buried her? He knows exactly where she's at. He knows exactly where she's at.
Joyce's son, Greg Roberts, is likewise skeptical.
I mean, it's such an intense situation. I know he could take you right to the spot immediately.
But where is that spot? Police and prosecutors showed with the Joyce Yost case they could prove a murder without a body. But their inability to bring Joyce home has left some deep scars.
My wife and my two little kids went up one time to Snow Basin area on a picnic, if you will. And we're having lunch, and I says, why don't we just walk down this area? And my wife looked at me and says, you're still looking, are you? I said, yeah, let's just walk. So we've got our little kids and we're just walking. I'm looking, and all of a sudden my wife yells at me and says, Terry, what if we find something? We tried. She's not there.
Terry is a Christian. He told me he believes in a resurrection. He expects to see Joyce again.
Someday we'll know. I look forward to that day and wonder if it's not something that I missed.
But the question of where to find Joyce, if not along the old Snow Basin Road, isn't the only one still in need of answers. You've heard Terry say in this podcast he believes Doug might have killed other people. There are others who call this far-fetched, and they may be right. I don't have firm evidence linking Doug Lovell with Cherie Warren, for instance. But Cherie's case is, like Joyce Yost's, long overdue for a fresh look. I'll have more to say about that in the future. Kim Salazar told me she believes the discovery of her mother's remains, if it happens, will be a matter of random chance.
I don't believe that even at the 11th hour, if we ever were to reach the 11th hour, that Doug would be the one that would give us that information. I truly, in my heart, believe that he won't. So I do think we're going to have to get there by some other means.
Perhaps, as I tend to suspect, Joyce is not far off the side of the highway that crosses the Monte Cristo Mountains, where a wildlife officer observed Doug and Rhonda together in late 1985. That's a piece of the puzzle that hardly anyone knew about before this podcast.
I did not know about that at all.
I'll show you some documents.
That's it. That's interesting.
I suggested to Bill Holthouse, Joyce might be in one of those aspen groves, buried under branches and leaves, out of sight of the hunters who frequent those hills, waiting for someone to step in just the right spot. Or maybe not. I made a vague reference to this theory in a letter of my own to Doug Lovell. Doug did not respond.
And it's a pattern with him that, he doesn't, want to disrespect the family or disrespect Joyce's memory. You're disrespecting Joyce by not saying her name, by not remembering her. She is a person. She was a living person. And it's just when you read that letter, I don't think he got it, and I still don't think he gets it.
The Utah Supreme Court's order sending Doug's appeal back to the trial court for an evidentiary hearing had carried a 90-day deadline. The hearing had not taken place until more than 2 years later. Judge Michael DeRita had told both sides at the conclusion to submit their proposed findings to him by the end of January 2020. Doug's appellate attorney Colleen Coburg asked for a 1-month extension with just days remaining due to a death in her family. She requested another delay in February, citing attorney health and workload. Then, March happened.
This is breaking news from KSL.
Good evening. We're following breaking news tonight. Jazz All-Star Rudy Gobert is confirmed to have the coronavirus, prompting the NBA to suspend the season indefinitely.
This comes as international health officials...
The Utah Jazz, the state's premier professional sports team, became a flashpoint in the global spread of COVID-19. Much of American society went into lockdown within hours of that announcement. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake rattled northern Utah a week later. It dealt damage to the building that houses the Utah State Archives.
Luckily, no one was injured. Officials say damages are primarily cosmetic, and the building is closed as authorities continue monitoring the aftershocks.
Colleen requested another extension, citing these unforeseeable circumstances. Month by month, delay by delay, the goalposts moved farther into the future. Doug lost touch with his lawyer, as he revealed in a letter to the court that July.
I have had no contact with my attorney for some time. I have no idea as to what's going on. Please send me a copy of my court docket for the last 90 days.
The Utah Attorney General's office submitted its proposed findings that fall. Colleen again asked for more time, prompting another letter from Doug in November.
I ask this court to not grant Miss Coburg any more extensions. Enough is enough. I am very frustrated.
Judge DeRita allowed one final delay, but warned if Colleen didn't submit her proposed findings by the end of January 2021, a full year after the original deadline, he would go ahead and issue his ruling without her input. Doug's attorney did get her proposed findings in, after the deadline. A few weeks later, at the end of February, Judge DeRita released his conclusions. The nearly 170-page document went against Doug on every point. In short, trial attorney Sean Young had not acted deficiently. A full point-by-point analysis would take more time than I have, so just a few observations. First, Judge DeRita said he found many of Doug's witnesses lacked credibility and exhibited bias brought on by their disappointment at the outcome of the 2015 trial. He said many of them had become, quote, hesitant or outright evasive when confronted with the facts of Doug's crimes at the evidentiary hearing. Second, Judge DeRita found no evidence that church lawyers had threatened any witnesses or interfered with their testimonies. Third, the judge said the settlement agreement Sean had signed over Doug's complaint to the state bar after the trial was, quote, unreliable and contained numerous factual inaccuracies. He placed little, if any, weight on what it had said. And fourth, Judge DeRita noted it was Doug's own insistence on refusing to allow the jury the option of life without parole that caused most of his defense team's problems. Michael Bowis and Sean Young had repeatedly pressed Doug to reconsider. They had known the best chance of saving his life was to push for life without parole. By denying them that strategy, Doug had effectively limited the value of his own witnesses. So where does all this leave us now? Doug's appeal is now back in the hands of the Utah Supreme Court. If the justices allow the latest death verdict to stand, it won't mean a quick end to the case. Years, if not decades, of additional appeals will likely follow. These could potentially drag the case into the federal courts. And if Doug loses every step of the way there, he will still have a chance to beg for commutation from the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. If, on the other hand, the Utah Supreme Court overturns the death verdict, it will pave the way for yet another trial. The tragedy is this all could have been prevented right from the start in the summer of 1985. Doug repeatedly slipped through the fingers of police, the courts, and jail staff. But it was Joyce who paid the price for those failures. Utah created a state office for victims of crime 2 years after Joyce's rape and murder, in part because it recognized people like her had too often been left to fend for themselves.
There would have been much more care and safety wrapped around Miss Yost to prevent this.
That's Gary Scheller, the head of the Utah Office for Victims of Crime.
She didn't have any knowledge. She didn't have the opportunity to protect herself.
In '94, the year after Doug's first death sentence, Utah voters ratified a Crime Victims' Bill of Rights.
Supporters of Proposition Number 1 say it's an important first step in making the court process more victim-friendly.
What we've seen with crime victims in the state of Utah is that they're treated like pieces of evidence. They're not really given any dignity at all.
The amendment says victims have the right to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. They also have the right to be notified of important court hearings. But supporters say most importantly, the amendment says victims don't have to testify at preliminary hearings. Someone else, such as a police officer, could do that for them.
This point strikes me as significant. It's a bit of a balancing act, because Bill Holthouse told me the entire rape case might have fallen apart in 1985 had Joyce not testified.
I don't think if she hadn't been to the prelim and they hadn't allowed the Davis County Attorney Secretary to read that, he might not have been convicted on the rape.
The argument is, if victims don't have to take the stand, it eases some of the trauma.
There is some opposition to the amendment from criminal defense attorneys, but the only aspect they're really against is the one that would eliminate the need for victims to testify at preliminary hearings.
A police officer testifying from what a third person told him that's written in a report doesn't always accurately tell us what happened in the case. And live witness testimony is the best mechanism available for discovering the truth.
The amendment passed in spite of that opposition. But Gary Scheller told me these rights, which are now enshrined in Utah's Constitution, are largely symbolic.
They're important and they're critical, but at the same time, they're just kind of warm and fuzzy and feel good and have no teeth.
What did have teeth was a massive federal crime bill passed into law by the U.S. Congress that same year, spearheaded by a senator who is now serving as President of the United States, Joe Biden. Much can and has been written about the more controversial provisions of this crime bill in the years since.
The legislation provides $8 billion for new prisons, $7 billion for crime prevention, and outlaws 19 types of assault weapons.
We will finally ban these assault weapons from our street that have no purpose other than to kill.
That ban on the possession, manufacture, and sale of some semi-automatic firearms has since expired.
Lots of new cops can soon be hired with funds from the bill, but Salt Lake's mayor admits it might be hard to meet the payroll when federal funding expires.
I'm always concerned about that, but I'm willing to take that risk. I think we can do it. I'm quite confident we can do it, and we will be applying. We need those officers right now.
That bulking up of police ranks has come under increasing scrutiny since the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. The crime bill expanded the death penalty, making many more federal offenses eligible for capital punishment.
Fulfilling the president's promise to get tough on crime will make lots of new work for Utah's U.S. attorney.
We've got to get on top of the provisions in this bill very quickly, and there are many that could potentially affect our work.
But most relevant for the purpose of our story is a portion of that crime bill known as the Violence Against Women Act.
We have significant penalties in here to deal with providing women with some genuine protection, particularly women who were battered and abused by their spouses, their loved ones, quote unquote, those with whom they're familiar.
Joe Biden, then a Democratic senator from Delaware, had personally authored that part of the package.
The only thing in this bill that I wrote from scratch was the Violence Against Women Act. That is a small part of this. Maybe that's why I was so emotionally attached to it.
Utah Republican Senator Orrin Hatch had railed against the crime bill, calling it stuffed with pork.
There are a lot of us who are just plain sick of trying to stop this gravy-sucking hog called the federal government and its liberal friends from eating us alive.
But Hatch had supported one small piece, the Violence Against Women Act, even crossing the aisle to co-sponsor that bit with Biden. The act aimed to close gaps that existed between police, prosecutors, courts, and nonprofit service providers in their support of victims of domestic abuse, stalking, and sexual violence. Its method of doing so came largely in the form of grants, federal money handed off to the states. Over the past 2.5 decades, Violence Against Women Act grants have helped fund domestic violence hotlines and rape crisis centers. They have allowed colleges and universities to crack down on stalking and sexual assaults. They have provided legal support to survivors. States have come to depend on these funds to provide critical services to women. But those grants are not eternal. They only continue if Congress votes to keep funding them every 5 years or so. At the time I am recording this, Violence Against Women Act funding has lapsed, and lawmakers have so far failed to reauthorize it. Joyce's experience proves one of the most critical needs for any survivor is information. Think back to that question she asked only hours after her rape. How safe am I?
He kept threatening me that if I didn't cooperate and if I didn't go with them, it was going to be the end of it for me.
That's exactly how he put it. It was just going to be the end of it for you?
Yeah, he was going to rip my vocal cords out here.
Joyce had had no way of tracking Doug Lovell in the weeks and months after his arrest. Was he in jail? Out of jail? She didn't know.
For a long time, that was really kind of treated as none of the victim's business, what we're doing with this person.
Again, that's Gary Scheller from the Utah Office for Victims of Crime. He told me most states now use a system called VINE to keep people like Joyce informed about their attacker's status.
And they can receive a notification if they're going to be released, if they have a hearing coming up with the Board of Probation and Parole, if they're moved from one correctional facility to another, they get a notification. So they can have some peace of mind knowing that they're at the moment safe.
Technology also now allows cops, courts, probation officers, and the like to more easily share information across jurisdictional lines. But lapses can and do still happen because people make mistakes, exhibit bias, are overworked or undertrained, or just burn out and stop caring. Joyce had trusted that the system would protect her, but her son Greg Roberts told me she had also just wanted to move on with her life.
She didn't tell me that she had been raped until a couple months after it happened, and then she really played it down.
Joyce had feared the humiliation of being labeled a victim and having her private life dissected in court, as she had seen happen on TV. That's less likely to happen now than it was in '85 because of state and federal rape shield laws. These laws say defendants cannot use information about an accuser's past sexual behavior or sexual predisposition as evidence, with only a few narrow exceptions. But while shield laws have strengthened protections in the court of law, one look at social media will show they hold no sway in the court of public opinion. Retired Clearfield Police Detective Bill Holthouse told me he thinks the chances of Doug ever getting out of prison are low. But maybe that's not the point.
I think that is the glimmer that he'll someday get out. I personally believe that he could con people then and he can con people now.
Back in episode 8, I described how prison staff moved Doug into maximum security in '92, after Terry Carpenter served him with the murder charge. Doug had gone from living in a dormitory setting where he was free to work and interact with others to spending all but 3 hours each day locked alone in his cell.
I'm hoping we can get this straightened out, pretty quick with the attorney and whatnot. I'd like to go back to work at the sign shop. I hear they're keeping my job for me. But they can't keep it forever.
When Doug wrote to my colleague Candice Madsen in 2019, the envelope showed he had sent the letter from Uinta 1, the maximum security cell block at the Utah State Prison that has for decades housed the state's death row inmates. But something interesting has happened in the time since. The Utah Department of Corrections moved Doug out of max. He is now living in medium security. I've been told he has a job again, working in the prison's welding shop. Fewer fences now separate him from the outside world. I was curious why this change, so I asked Corrections Director Brian Nielsen to explain it.
Those that have a death sentence, they've been in very restrictive housing traditionally for a very long time, without the option to do anything else.
Brian wouldn't talk specifically about Doug's case, but said the department implemented a policy in 2005 called Last Chance. He says it allows inmates to earn their way out of max.
So they've really had to demonstrate that they can function in that setting ahead of time, and then we test the waters in small incremental ways to help them get there.
But something doesn't add up, because at the time I'm recording this, the department's own website says the policy doesn't apply to death row inmates. The website says the only way off of max for them is to have their convictions overturned or sentences commuted, which contradicts what Brian told me.
We've had a couple make it that far, but it's taken, 13, 14 years to get there.
More than a couple. Prison records show of the 7 inmates under sentence of death in Utah in June of 2021, only 2 of them are still in maximum security at the Uinta facility.
That risk is going to be inherent in that process, and we keep our guard up all the time while looking for opportunities to help people advance.
There is a logic in allowing inmates a path forward. The vast majority are only in prison temporarily. It's the goal of the department to help offenders change their ways and avoid coming back once released. Even people serving life without parole sentences might be easier to manage if given an opportunity to better their own situations in some small way. But Utah's courts have twice said Doug should die for what he did. Which means the state now finds itself in the awkward position of simultaneously arguing in court Doug is a manipulator who has conned people into supporting his bid for parole, while at the same time granting him additional freedoms based on his ability to convince prison staff and social workers he is not a threat.
And I know these are professional counselors that he's with. I understand that. They've got a lot of training, so do I. But he's a con artist.
I requested a copy of the last chance policy under Utah's public records law. The department refused to provide it, claiming it was protected because release could interfere with investigations or audits. Doug Lovell murdered Joyce Yost to keep her from testifying. He tampered with Tom Peters to try and intimidate him into not testifying. He used his last stint on the outside, after convincing the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole he had changed, to rape and to kill. How does all that balance now against Doug's good behavior while in prison?
Two-part question. One, does he have a realistic chance of ever getting out of prison? Two, does he have a realistic chance of ever being put to death?
One, no. Two, also no.
Bill Holthouse told me he believes it's unlikely prosecutors will win a death verdict a third time if Doug gets yet another trial.
If there's another jury here, it's going to be a jury of people who weren't even born when this happened. And they're not going to be able to relate. But I think he'll be convicted again if we go back to trial. The evidence was good. It's still good, and I have no doubt. But I would be surprised if they once again pursued the death penalty.
Utah has not executed a death row inmate since 2010. It hasn't added someone to death row, accepting Doug's 2015 return, since 2008. Utah's Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice released a report a few years back that noted public support for the death penalty in the U.S. has waned to its lowest point since 1972. The report cited a Gallup poll, which showed death penalty support in the 1990s, when Doug was first sentenced to death, was near 80%. As of a few years ago, that had fallen to about 55%. As of 2020, half of the states in the U.S. had abolished the death penalty or placed capital punishment on indefinite hold. Joyce's family, meantime, remains steadfast in their push to see Doug Lovell die.
I don't see it ever happening.
Even though Greg Roberts acknowledges they are swimming against the currents of culture and criminal process.
That's why I just don't know if they'll ever carry it out in this case, because it's still got so many years to go.
Do I think in my lifetime that I'll ever see Doug get the death penalty? Will it ever go through? No.
Kim and Randy Salazar have each been ground down by the decades of never-ending court hearings.
And Doug, if you were any kind of man, you'd be dead right now because you would ask for the death penalty just to be over with.
Neither believes Joyce's killer will ever win parole.
Somewhere in his mind, he believes he's going to. I think he really believes that someday he could walk out of there.
The taxpayers have paid so much money for him to be down there and to get lawyers and to tell his side of the story and tell his side of the story. Well, the son of a bitch is guilty. And you sentence him to death. Get it over with.
Meaning Doug Lovell might just remain in limbo until the day he dies of natural causes, as has happened to 2 other Utah death row inmates in recent years.
I think that we have a better chance of him dying of old age in there than we do of him dying by the hand of the state.
Do I think that's fair? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But do I hope one day that he has to see Joyce again? Hell yeah. And do I hope that Rhonda has to see Joyce again? Hell yeah.
I'm not here to advocate for Doug's life or death. It's not my intent to take a position on capital punishment. But it's worth considering the collateral damage of a case like Doug's. The justice system finds itself struggling to balance the cries for vengeance from people like Joyce's ex-husband Mel Roberts
I'm probably the one person that could have got in an airplane, went up there and shot that son of a bitch and got up and left and got away with it, and nobody had known the difference. Trust me, I thought of it. I swear to God, I thought of it.
Against Doug's civil rights and the pleas for mercy from people like Becky Douglas.
When you talk to someone and they're crying so hard they can't talk to you because they feel so bad about what they've done, you say angry with himself. Yes, he was furious with himself over what he had done.
It is perhaps an impossible balance to strike. A bit earlier, I talked about how I first came to know Joyce's story. What I didn't tell you was the sense of dread I felt at taking on the assignment of telling it. I knew from the outset I would have to contend with a very sensitive topic. I worried about all the mistakes and missteps I might make as a man in this space, trying to share Joyce's perspective. It was in some ways similar to how I felt in Season 1, telling the story of Susan Powell's abusive marriage. The difference is, Susan left us a better record of her thoughts, actions, and feelings. Much of what I know about Joyce's life comes only secondhand. Yet the more I have learned about Joyce as a person, not just as a name in a news story, the more empathy I've gained for what she went through. Look, I enjoy a place of privilege in society. Strange guys don't follow me home when I go out to dinner with a friend. I have never worried that a woman might grab me by the throat and tear my clothes off outside my own house. This privilege can breed complacency. It can make me blind to what Joyce and so many other women experience every day. And that is injustice. This season bears a subtitle, Justice for Joyce. And I have to be honest, I don't love it. It seems trite to me. It doesn't capture the way I felt the first time I heard Joyce's voice in that tape recording with Bill Holthouse just hours after her rape. It can't convey how I hurt for her when I listen to her voice cracking, saying the words, "I have been raped." How I still break down and cry when she asks a police officer, "How safe am I?" Justice for Joyce reduces what she went through to a tagline, and I hate that. I voiced this complaint and was challenged to come up with something better. And I couldn't do it.
There is no justice for Joyce. Let's just preface it by saying that. When you kill somebody, you kill somebody. There's no such thing. It's justice for what he did to Joyce.
Joyce hadn't wanted to go to Detective Bill Holthouse after Doug Lovell followed her home, raped her, kidnapped her, and raped her again. She had simply wanted what so many other people who experience unexpected trauma want: a return to normalcy and a restoration of safety. Joyce would have been justified if she had chosen to stay silent. But she spoke up because she felt a responsibility to help protect whomever Doug might have targeted next. And for a brief moment, it seemed the system might work. Bill believed Joyce. Doug landed in jail. She spoke her truth in court. Then all the mechanisms of law and civil society that were meant to protect her failed. The people who were closest to Doug repeatedly rewarded him, the handsome white guy from a good Christian family, with the benefit of the doubt, even after he had proved he didn't deserve it. They chose to believe him when he said he had been falsely accused, or at least decided to look the other way. Some are still doing so, even today, dissociating the Doug they know from the one who chose to kill Joyce Yost. Joyce paid for her courage with her life. So what message does that send to every other woman who has ever been groped, catcalled, stalked, assaulted, or raped, and feared coming forward? Imagine the tragedy of a Joyce who had lived by keeping the rape a secret, spending her entire life plagued by undeserved guilt and self-doubt, wondering how many others that man had gone on to terrorize. How many men have allowed, still allow, their privilege to blind them to what so many women endure in silence? I don't want to be one of them. If you or someone you know has endured rape, sexual assault, or sexual abuse of any kind, help is available. In the United States, you can call 1-800-656-HOPE or visit RAINN.org to connect with free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. No one need suffer in silence. You are not alone. If you haven't already, please subscribe to or follow Cold to make sure you get every episode. You can also interact with me and the Cold team on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Cold Podcast. Cold is researched and written by Dave Cawley, with editorial oversight by executive producer Cheryl Worsley. Additional executive producers include Paul Anderson, Nick Piniella, and Andrew Greenwood. Audio production by Nina Ernest. Mixing by Trent Sell. Michael Bonmiller composed the main score. Special thanks to the team at Amazon Music. Full credits for each episode are available at thecoldpodcast.com. Cold is an Amazon original by KSL Podcasts in association with Workhouse Media. Thank you for listening.